January 3rd, 2026, 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time. Donald Trump was awake as always, scrolling through his Truth Social feed when he decided to make history. With a few taps on his phone, he posted the words that would define his second presidency. The United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolás Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. Half a world away, in the pre-dawn darkness of Caracas, explosions echoed across the Venezuelan capital. Smoke rose from the presidential palace. Fighter jets screamed overhead, and in the span of a few hours, the United States had accomplished what it had been trying to achieve for over 2 decades: the removal of a Venezuelan government that refused to bow to Washington's demands. But this was not the surgical operation that Trump's post made it seem. This was the culmination of a months-long escalation that had begun as a war on drugs and ended as a war on sovereignty itself. It was the story of how America's fight against narco-trafficking became a blueprint for 21st century regime change. And it revealed something profound about how great powers behave when they decide that international law no longer applies to them. To understand how Trump's second presidency began with a military invasion of a sovereign nation, you need to understand the journey that led to those explosions in Caracas. It did not start on January 3rd. It started on September 2nd, 2025, when Trump announced what his administration called a total war against narco-terrorism in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. The justification was compelling, at least on the surface. Drug trafficking from South America to the United States had reached crisis levels. Fentanyl overdoses were killing over 100,000 Americans annually, and Venezuela, according to U.S. intelligence, had become a major transit point for cocaine and other illegal drugs heading north. Trump's solution was characteristically direct: destroy the boats carrying drugs before they reached American waters. We're going to use the full power of the United States to take on and eradicate these drug cartels, no matter where they're operating from, the president declared. What he didn't say was that no matter where would eventually include the territorial waters and mainland of a sovereign nation. The first strikes came in early September. U.S. Navy vessels and Coast Guard cutters began intercepting boats in international waters that they claimed were carrying illegal drugs. When the crews of these vessels resisted, American forces opened fire. The official Pentagon position was that these were law enforcement actions against criminal organizations, not military actions against foreign nationals. But the reality on the water was different. The boats being targeted were often small fishing vessels or cargo ships operating in waters that Venezuela considered its territorial sea. The crews were not armed drug traffickers, but ordinary sailors trying to make a living in one of the world's most economically devastated countries. Many had no drugs on board when they were attacked. By December 2025, the death toll from these counter-narcotics operations had reached 104 confirmed fatalities, according to United Nations investigators. Not a single one of the individuals killed had been posing an immediate threat that would justify the use of lethal force under international law. They were summary executions carried out in the name of drug enforcement, but justified by an expanding definition of what constituted a threat to American national security. The escalation was systematic and deliberate. In October, Trump declared Venezuelan airspace closed in its entirety, leading international airlines to suspend flights to the country. In November, the administration designated the Venezuelan government as a foreign terrorist organization, a classification that had never before been applied to a sovereign state. In December, Trump announced a total and complete blockade of Venezuelan oil shipments. Each step was presented as a response to Venezuelan aggression, but the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. The United States was methodically isolating Venezuela from the international community while building the legal justification for direct military action. The war on drugs was becoming a war on Venezuela itself. The turning point came on December 15th, when a CIA drone struck a port facility on the Venezuelan coast, marking the first known American attack on Venezuelan territory. The target, according to U.S. officials, was a narco-terrorist logistics hub. Venezuelan authorities said it was a civilian where fishing boats loaded supplies. The strike killed 8 people and wounded 23 others. Maduro's response was defiant but measured. He condemned the attack as an act of war, but did not retaliate militarily. Instead, he called for an emergency session of the UN Security Council and demanded international intervention to stop what he characterized as American aggression. The Venezuelan president understood that he was being baited into a conflict that his military could not win, but Trump was not interested in Venezuelan restraint. On December 20th, he announced that the United States had credible intelligence that Maduro was personally involved in directing drug trafficking operations and had placed a $50 million bounty on his head. The message was unmistakable. The United States was no longer targeting Venezuelan drug traffickers, it was targeting the Venezuelan government itself. The final phase began on January 1, 2026, when American naval forces established what Pentagon officials called a maritime security perimeter around Venezuelan waters. Any vessel attempting to enter or leave Venezuelan ports would be subject to inspection and potential seizure. It was, in all but name, a naval blockade, an act of war under international law. Venezuela's allies recognized what was happening and began mobilizing to support Maduro's government. Russian and Iranian warships moved toward Venezuelan waters. Chinese officials warned that an attack on Venezuela would be considered an attack on China's economic interests in the region. Cuba placed its military on high alert and began evacuating non-essential personnel from its embassy in Caracas. But these gestures of support were symbolic rather than substantive. Venezuela was geographically isolated from its allies, surrounded by countries that were either neutral or actively hostile to the Maduro government. When the final American assault came, help was too far away to matter. The operation itself was a masterpiece of military planning and execution. For months, U.S. Special Forces had been infiltrating Venezuela through Colombia and Brazil, establishing safe houses and gathering intelligence on government installations. American satellites had mapped every military facility, every communication node, and every potential escape route. At 4:30 a.m. local time on January 3, the assault began with a coordinated cyber attack that disabled Venezuela's air defense systems, communication networks, and electrical grid. Simultaneously, cruise missiles launched from American naval vessels struck key military installations around Caracas and other major cities. The Venezuelan military, caught completely off guard, was unable to mount any coherent resistance. The capture of Maduro himself was the culmination of a months-long intelligence operation. American agents had identified his location through electronic surveillance and human intelligence assets within the Venezuelan government. A Delta Force team, inserted by helicopter under cover of the broader military assault, reached the presidential compound and detained both Maduro and his wife without a shot being fired. By 7 a.m., it was over. The Venezuelan government had effectively ceased to exist. Maduro was on a U.S. military aircraft heading for American soil to face charges of narco-terrorism and conspiracy. Venezuelan military units were surrendering or abandoning their posts, and Trump was announcing the success of what he called a brilliant operation to his 80 million followers on Truth Social. The international reaction was swift and overwhelmingly negative. The UN Security Council convened an emergency session within hours, with Russia, China, and Iran condemning what they characterized as an illegal act of aggression. Brazil's President Lula da Silva said the American action crossed an unacceptable line. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum invoked Article 2 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. But the American response revealed something crucial about how the Trump administration viewed international law in 2026. When confronted with accusations that the attack violated the UN Charter, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz simply dismissed the criticism. The illegitimate Maduro regime posed an extraordinary threat to our hemisphere's peace and stability, he declared. We will do everything in our considerable power to protect our hemisphere, our borders, and the American people. The word illegitimate was key to understanding the American legal strategy. Because the United States did not recognize Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela, having declared opposition leader Edmundo González the rightful president after disputed elections in July 2024, Trump administration argued that it was not attacking a sovereign government, but rather removing a criminal organization that had illegally seized power. This argument was creative, but completely without basis in international law. The principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states does not depend on whether one country recognizes another's government as legitimate. The UN Charter applies to all member states, regardless of the political preferences of other members. More fundamentally, the Venezuelan operation revealed that the United States was willing to abandon the international legal framework that it had helped create after World War II, when that framework no longer served its interests. The UN system, NATO, the Geneva Conventions, all of these institutions were based on the principle that sovereign states had certain rights that could not be violated by other states, regardless of how objectionable their governments might be. Trump's Venezuela strike shattered that principle. It established the precedent that the United States could unilaterally declare another government illegitimate and use military force to remove it, so long as it could construct a plausible legal justification based on American domestic law rather than international law. The operation was also a watershed moment for what scholars call humanitarian imperialism, the use of moral arguments to justify military intervention. The Trump administration had framed the entire escalation as a war against drug trafficking and human rights abuses, but the actual target was Venezuela's refusal to align with American economic and political interests. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, larger than those of Saudi Arabia. Its territory contains vast deposits of gold, diamonds, and rare earth minerals, and its strategic location gives it control over shipping lanes that are crucial to trade between North and South America. These resources had been largely inaccessible to American companies since Hugo Chavez nationalized the oil industry in the early 2000s. The humanitarian arguments were not entirely fabricated. Maduro's government had indeed been responsible for serious human rights abuses. The economy was in free fall, millions of Venezuelans had fled the country, and democratic institutions had been systematically dismantled. But these problems had existed for years without triggering American military intervention. What changed was not Venezuelan behavior, but American willingness to use force to achieve regime change. The timing was also significant. Trump's second presidency had begun with promises to restore American dominance in its traditional sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine, which proclaimed the Americas as an American sphere of influence, was being updated for the 21st century. Countries in the region would be expected to align with American interests or face the consequences. China and Russia had spent decades building relationships with Latin American governments as part of their strategy to challenge American hegemony. Venezuela was a key ally for both countries, providing oil to China and hosting Russian military advisors. The removal of Maduro sent a clear message to other regional leaders: alignment with America's adversaries would not be tolerated. But the Venezuelan operation also revealed the limits of American power in a multipolar world. While the United States had the military capability to remove the Maduro government, it did not have the political support to legitimize the action or the economic resources to rebuild Venezuelan institutions. Russia and China, while unable to prevent the American attack, began implementing economic and diplomatic measures to punish the United States for its aggression. Chinese companies suspended contracts with American firms. Russian energy exports to America's allies were reduced. Iran threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz if the United States attempted similar actions against other countries. More importantly, the Venezuelan strike accelerated the formation of alternative international institutions designed to challenge American hegemony. Within weeks of Maduro's capture, China, Russia, Iran, and other countries announced the creation of a new international court to prosecute crimes of aggression committed by Western powers. The court would operate in direct competition with the International Criminal Court, which these countries viewed as biased toward Western interests. The domestic American reaction was more complex than might have been expected. While Trump's base celebrated the removal of what they saw as a communist dictatorship in America's backyard, many Americans were uncomfortable with the precedent that had been set. Opinion polls showed that while a majority supported counter-narcotics operations, only 35% supported military action to remove foreign governments. Congressional Democrats demanded investigations into whether Trump had legal authority to launch the attack without congressional approval. Republican leaders supported the president but privately worried about the long-term implications of abandoning international law. Military leaders, while professionally executing their orders, expressed concerns about the sustainability of a foreign policy based on unilateral force. The Venezuelan operation also highlighted the evolution of warfare in the 21st century. Unlike previous American military interventions, which had relied heavily on ground forces and occupying armies, the Venezuela strike was conducted primarily through cyber warfare, precision strikes, and special operations forces. The entire operation lasted less than 12 hours and involved fewer than 1,000 American personnel. This light footprint approach was designed to minimize American casualties and reduce the political costs of military action, but it also reflected a fundamental shift in how the United States projected power. Instead of seeking to control territory or build democratic institutions, America was increasingly focused on removing governments it considered hostile and installing compliant replacements. The capture of Maduro was not the end of the Venezuelan crisis, but the beginning of a new phase. With the former president in American custody facing charges that could result in life imprisonment, Venezuela faced an uncertain future. Opposition leader González, whom the United States recognized as the legitimate president, was in exile in Spain and had limited support inside the country. Venezuelan military leaders, who had not been captured or killed in the initial assault, faced a choice: accept American-backed leadership or continue resistance from clandestine bases. Some chose collaboration, hoping to preserve some degree of Venezuelan autonomy under a new government. Others chose resistance, beginning what promised to be a long guerrilla campaign against American occupation. The oil reserves that had motivated much of American interest in regime change remained largely inaccessible. International companies were reluctant to invest in Venezuelan infrastructure, while the country's legal status remained unclear, and Venezuela's allies had begun implementing measures to make it difficult for American companies to benefit from the resources they had sought to control. 3 days after Maduro's capture, as international condemnation continued to mount and resistance groups began forming in Venezuela's interior, a question loomed over American foreign policy: what came next? The United States had demonstrated that it could remove governments it disliked, but it had not demonstrated that it could build sustainable alternatives. The Venezuela strike had been sold as a counter-narcotics operation, but drug trafficking routes were already shifting to other countries. It had been justified as humanitarian intervention, but Venezuelan civilians were more likely to suffer under military occupation than they had under Maduro's rule. It had been framed as democratic liberation, but the result was likely to be long-term American domination rather than genuine self-determination. Most fundamentally, the Venezuelan operation represented a return to 19th century concepts of international relations, where powerful nations imposed their will on weaker neighbors through military force. The rules-based international order that had governed global affairs since World War II was being replaced by a system based on raw power and national interest. Trump had promised to make America great again. The Venezuela strike was his vision of American greatness in action, swift, decisive, and unconstrained by international law or allied concerns. Whether this vision would restore American hegemony or accelerate its decline remained to be seen.